Welcome back. In the first section of this lecture, we thought about the structural ways in which disease ecologies really allowed or prevented empires from expanding in certain ways. But what we should recognize is that understanding that we have based upon our scientific knowledge of how diseases work and our theories of how that happens that have evolved in the 19th and 20th centuries is that that's imposing upon this period things that contemporaries didn't understand. So we can see diseases as having this agency to delimit empire, but we also have to recognize that Europeans had their own conceptions of how diseases operated, and those went on to inform the decisions that they themselves made about how they would develop their empires. And so we need to now turn towards thinking about the ways that they conceptualized disease themselves. And the main way in which they did that in this period was through Renaissance ideas of medicine that had roots in this Renaissance classical revival of works by people like Hippocrates and Aristotle. The Renaissance is really all about the revival, the veneration of the ancient and classical knowledge, and the belief that these people have superior understanding, or these writers had superior understanding of things. And so they turn back in a major way to the idea of the four humours that defined classical writing about medicine. You may have already touched upon this in other parts of this course, so I'm only going to briefly note that in this theory of the four humours, the world is defined by four elements: water, fire, earth, and air, and that those are modelled inside the individual, according to this theory, in a sort of sense that the body can be too wet, too dry, too hot, and too cold, and that the balance between those humours is critical to health, and that if they get out of whack, that's what causes disease. Now, foundational to this then is this idea that the body is ultimately porous, that it can be shaped by and informed by the environment that it grows up in and that it adapts to. And so you can see here from the English physician John Jocelyn in 1672 this theory being put into words, that there's a certain agreement that is between a place and the thing that's bred in that place, that effectively people are used to the humoral balance of their environment that informs the humoral balance inside them, and that when they travel to new places, that imbalance is thrown off. And that explains why disease happens to Europeans in these ways. And so that essentially this is a very naturalist explanation for disease. It's an explanation that makes disease seem in some respects less threatening and troubling, these endemic diseases, because they are basically a natural human response to imbalances in environment, to new forms of environment. So Europeans expect this to happen, but they also expect it to understand it as natural and not potentially kind of ruling out expansion to new environments. They see effectively all of the diseases that they encounter in extra-European places as not inherently different and more threatening and more dangerous and more exotic diseases, as they will go on to do later on, as we'll see in the next section. But at this point, as the same diseases they encounter in different parts of Europe, but just taken to more extremes because of more extreme environments that they encounter. And so every time they get to a new environment, they have to adjust their humours, and there is a natural process of that adjustment. And that they can expedite that process using exactly the same methods of healing and medicine that they've used in Europe. So there doesn't need to be a new form of medicine to deal with these endemic diseases in the New World, because they are essentially the same diseases. So they employ the same methods. For example, you can see in the picture on the left-hand side here, bloodletting, which is one of the major ways of treating humoral imbalances. Which was that you might have too much blood in your system, and so you would cut a vein, or you'd cut a vein and allow a certain precise quantity of blood to be let out to reduce the excess of blood in your system, which was pushing your humoral balance one way. Or you might give somebody a potion that would have a laxative effect, or the opposite of a laxative effect, in order to try to adjust balances of fluids and bodily functions to return to this balance. And so these are the methods they use in Europe. These are the methods that they think about taking to colonial wars. They think they have all of the medicine that they need to adapt to these new environments. And they also see this as fundamentally a natural challenge of being in the New World. So with the exception of certain people like the Puritans, they tend to not think about this in a divine and spiritual way because they're drawing upon the classics. They don't tend to connect this as much with spirituality and Christianity. They tend to think that going to the New World is just a natural challenge that you can adjust the humans and you can be fine. By contrast, of course, indigenous people being slowed down by virgin soil epidemics are receiving God's judgment, right? But particularly the Puritans push that narrative. But to other people, disease is not as connected directly to the divine intervention of the divine in the world, and therefore, particularly for Northern European Protestants, and so therefore, it affecting humorial balance can mean that even if a colony is slowed down by disease, right, even if large numbers of Europeans are killed, it doesn't mean divine opposition to a colonial venture. It just means the necessity of needing to reestablish humorial balance. So it helps them then to frame colonialism. It also is particularly important to English people in this period because the English have a very odd relationship with this humorial theory. Because humorial theory had emerged in classical writing in the Mediterranean, it had all been about framing the idea that the Mediterranean climate was the best for maintaining humorial balance. And the extremes that they cited were, and generally, Ethiopia on one extent and Britain on the other extent, as being these dangerous climates which were extremes one way or the other, of hot and dry or cold and wet, that pushed off the humorial balance that was true of the Mediterranean world. And so English people absorbing this are already kind of conscious that they have changed their humorial balance to adapt so that to English people, England is now no longer what the classical authors thought it was, as an uncivil society. It had become civil because English bodies had adapted to that climate. And so they are very well aware going into the New World that they're able to adapt to different environments and reset their humorial balance. They're also very critically conscious that they want to find new climates that maybe do look more like the Mediterranean, because the classical authors have said that maybe that's better. So the two sides of this drive English people to think about the adaptation of their own bodies to colonial environments in particular ways. And so humorial theory then helps them to conceptualize the idea of adjusting to the environments of New World locations. And part of this then is this conception that humorial that the environments of the New World will have within them their own ways of helping people to balance their humours. So there's a lot of writing in this period, admittedly very promotional and about promoting colonization, about the fact that once people experience the air or the new foods of new environments, it will help their bodies to adjust. So yes, there may be lots of people killed by disease in the initial years of settlement, but that once people become adapted to the environment, they will kind of adjust. And so you see, even somewhere like Jamaica, which, as McNeill shows you, has these horrific levels of mortality amongst early English colonists. English writers, though, particularly like the scientist Hans Sloane, who goes on to found the British Museum, Hans Sloane spends a lot of time in Jamaica and writes that the air and the foods will basically are good and wholesome, and that they will help people to adjust gradually. So yes, they may die in large numbers initially, but once they consume the right things and they live in the right air, it will help their body to reestablish a humorial balance. William Hughes, who writes the first big book about medicine in the Americas in English, The American Physician in 1672, also reflects these ideas. He sort of says that the plants and animals in the Americas are, quote, generally of a more masculine virtue than of any same species in England, but not so terrible a degree as to be mischievous or ineffectual to our English bodies. And so, end quote. And so, in that way, the environment of the Americas is beneficial to people. It's more extreme, but that more extreme environment is more masculine, more virtuous. It helps people to reestablish their virtue and their health in this new environment, and to combat the effects of disease. So there's this belief in a natural balance that gives people confidence to confront these diseases in the 17th century and to actually get through the first waves of illness in these places. And this helps to frame to Europeans a conception of the idea that they will adjust to their environments, and that what the English call, quote unquote, seasoning, the idea that after having passed through one round of seasons in a particular New World environment, you'll be adjusted to that environment. Now, we would understand that as being the development of immunity, right, to diseases. But in their conception, this is about adjusting to the environment and establishing a new humoral balance. And it goes on to shape the way that they think about labor, right? Because many of the English people who are brought to English America in the 17th century are brought over as servants. They're brought over as servants to labor, and generally brought over under indentures that last for 4 or 5 years. So you might sign on a contract to work for somebody for 4 or 5 years in exchange for your passage to the Americas, and then after that time you would be freed. Now, the theory behind that 4 or 5 years of labor factors into it this conception that has become widespread by the 1620s and 30s, that Europeans need to be seasoned, that English colonists will need to be seasoned to the American environment. And so you assume that in the first year, when you buy a servant, if you're a planter in the Chesapeake, for example, that you will need to allow them a lighter workload for the first year until they are seasoned. And once they are seasoned, their value will go up in terms of selling them to other people, their potential work ability will improve. And so the 4 or 5 years factors in this differential level of seasoning. And this also goes on to how they think about and value enslaved people, right? Their capacity to be seasoned by the environment. And so all of this then has implications for how the labor system is structured in these early English American colonies around the ideas of seasoning that is so critical to how they think about coming to and becoming adapted to colonialism. This, of course, has some interesting implications for ideas about difference and race in the very early colonial environments. Because of this idea that all bodies are porous and they adapt to their environments, what it effectively means is that race as a strict and immutable category is not as clear in the 17th century. People have this conception that there are that all bodies, be they African bodies, indigenous bodies, English bodies, adapt to the new environments that they come to, and that skin color is merely one part of a broader adaptation, that race was more than just pigment. Africans adapted in all sorts of ways, and that Europeans in different environments might adapt in different ways. Their skin pigmentation might change. That was just one part of the whole ways in which people adapted. You can see here that continues to even have an effect in this essay, the cover page of which I provided here, by John Mitchell, who's still writing in the 1740s in Virginia about the causes of different colors of people in different climates, that race is not tied to inherent genetics, but is about climate, and skin coloration is just one part of racial formation. And so this means that Europeans have this conception that Africans are actually all part of a common humanity that's adapting. That means that actually, and that's part of why race as a strict category is not what really defines the enslavement of Africans in the mid-17th century. The rationale for enslavement of Africans in English America in this period is much more built around the fact that they are not Christian, rather than that they are black or Negro, as they will go on to term those things in the 18th century. And we'll think about that in the next section of this course, of this lecture. But in this case, they think about all of these different people's ability to adapt. They also think about this in terms of their own abilities to adapt, right? They see, in some respects, Africans' ability and differential immunity, which they have to yellow fever and malaria for various reasons related to their African origin that we've already discussed. They see that as evidence that, in some respects, maybe Europeans are more sensitive to their environments than Africans are, and that is actually both a good and a bad thing, right? Because the culture of sensibility in Europe in this period is privileging the idea that it's good to have a body that's particularly sensitive to its environment and sensitive to the feelings and emotions of other people. So to be sensitive is good. But on the other hand, to be overly sensitive might imply luxury and the dangers of foppishness and being too attuned to emotions, and that can be in some senses inhibiting of hard labor and hard work. And so they actually see the differential ways in which Africans and Europeans adapt to New World environments as not necessarily being that everybody's adapting, right? And that Europeans are adapting in ways that are both particularly better but also worse than what Africans are doing. And so all of this then means that race is a sort of amorphous category here that's only just forming, and the ideas about labor are framed by this primarily by this idea of humoral change. The other big part of this then is that Europeans worry, though, that they are going through this process of change themselves, that they are adapting, that they're creolizing to Europe, to New World environments. And creolization cuts both ways, right? So in this world, there is an advantage to being to having a distinct identity as Creole. To have come through this process of seasoning, to have their humours changed, to be country people, quote, versus strangers. And you see this theory that they are better adjusted to their environment and that Europeans shouldn't, that European empires can't impose upon them. So it helps to reinforce colonial identity in ways that are going to frame, particularly in the northern 13 colonies, a sense of English colonial identity that will push back against the metropole by the time you get to 1776. An idea that colonists are different because they're more immune to certain diseases, they are more suited to America because of the fact that they've gone through this seasoning. On the other hand, though, that seasoning process can mean that metropolitan figures can think about their personalities. The Creole personality is different. I mentioned Hans Sloane having this belief that the environment of Jamaica would ultimately balance people out, but he does still admit in those writings on Jamaica that as a result, creolized populations of English people in Jamaica will have, different passions of mind, that women will be, as you can see here, more hysterical, that men will be more hypochondriacal. Than they are in Europe. And you can see from the image here this depiction of the West Indian planter in the mid-18th century as being foppish and lazy and degenerate because of the effect of the environment, because they have creolized to the West Indies. What's actually going on here is that this is supposed to be a depiction of a West Indian bird shooting, right, where he can't be bothered to move out of his seat, where he's not strong enough to move out of his seat where he's resting under the sun with his enslaved person holding the umbrella, and so he's having another enslaved person push the birds towards him so he can shoot them from his seat. And this idea that something about the West Indies has weakened this West Indian planter, the creolization has weakened him, is on the negative side here, and this is true in the northern colonies too, right? You see from the poem here, from the Sotweed Factor, that the perception, which is a poem from Maryland from 1708, this depiction of planters in the northern colonies as being kind of a weaker genetic's the wrong word because they're not thinking in terms of genes yet, but being a weaker form of humanity, a figure so strange that no god designed to be part of humankind, right? Because they have adapted to this environment, and that they are brittle as clay because of their connection to the environment, and most particularly that they are, quote, hue as tawny as a moor. And this goes to this bigger fear, right, that by adapting humours that Europeans will actually become more and more like Africans. So the mutability of race that I was talking about earlier means that creolization always contains this fear, and as an increasing fear of blackness becomes part of European conceptions. The idea that creolization makes people, changes their skin pigmentations, changes their language, changes other elements of their personalities, makes them more African, or in frontier areas of America, makes them more indigenous, makes them seem more like Indians, that all of these things are worrying to Europeans. That people will go native, or they will become, quote, swarthy in their complexion. And this also even cuts between colonies, right? So I mentioned here that William Byrd, the Virginia planter, talks about North Carolina in this period, in the early 18th century, and he writes this diary in which he tours North Carolina, and he depicts these people as being distinct from Virginians because, interestingly, he says that they consume a lot of pork. So anybody who's still a fan of Carolina barbecue will appreciate that, back in this 18th century, Carolina is associated with consumption of pork, and that this consumption of pork is seen to throw off this humoral balance and make Carolinians more porcine, right? More disheveled, rude, lazy, and has all these negative connotations because of the way that they've adapted to their environment, to the foodstuffs of their environment, and so forth. So in all of these ways, creolization cuts both ways. And hopefully what you can see in looking at the Chaplin reading that was assigned is the ways in which colonial leaders, particularly in South Carolina in her writing, are attempting to mold a story in which they can adapt to their environment, they can pull certain bits of scientific knowledge to portray their adaptation, their seasoning to the Carolina environment as both a positive thing, but also something that still maintains their Anglo identity. The ways in which they're desperate to see themselves as both adapted, but also still part of a larger English Atlantic scientific, civilized community. And so think about, as you read that, the ways in which Carolinians balance this idea of humoral change and seasoning with their English identity, and how they sought to craft that. And then as we go into the next section, we'll think about the ways in which some of these mutabilities and changeabilities of human bodies that arise from the humoral theory are going to be changed by the development of scientific understandings that are going to harden ideas about race in the 18th century. And so that's where we're going to go next.